Good afternoon. I'm Jeremy Dawson, the Digital Media Manager at NAST, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled An Overview of September in Congress and What's Next in 2017. I hope this webinar finds you all well, and I want to thank all of you out there for tuning in this afternoon. We have the webinar scheduled for an hour and a lot of great content here, so I'll try and be brief. I'm here to show you how to use the webinar features we have available. In the handouts section, you can download the slide deck for your reference, as well as brief bios on our speakers. You can also interact with us by typing questions into the box in the questions section at any time during the presentation. The moderator will present these questions at the end of the formal presentation. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the webinar archive on the NAST website for your future reference. Now, on behalf of NAST and the Legislative Committee, I would like to welcome and thank our speakers for presenting to our membership today and our attendees for joining us. Treasurer Damshin, at this point, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our September Legislative Committee webinar. I think this is going to be an especially interesting one. We have a little bit more to talk about with tax reform now on the radar and a handful of specifics we can talk about. I'm excited to hear what Matt has to tell us. We're going to spend a few minutes taking inventory, looking back a little bit, talk a little bit about budget, debt limit, healthcare, and looking forward. Of course, things are going to get really interesting now with the basic elements of the GOP tax reform proposal on the table, and a lot of sausage making yet to come in the weeks ahead. And so with that, I encourage you to post your questions, as Jeremy suggested, as they come up. I'll watch for those, and we'll address those questions as they come. And thanks again for joining us today. Without further ado, I'll hand it off to Matt Hoekstra with Williams & Jensen. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you, Treasurer. I am Matt Hoekstra with Williams & Jensen, and pleased to be with everyone here today. I too agree with the introductory comments that this is a great time to be doing a recap, as the last few months, and particularly September, saw a lot of legislative activity, and is really going to inform us as to where Congress and the administration are going for the remainder of the year, and also, of course, into 2018, which people are very much starting to focus on. Let's start off with the first slide, Jeremy. Sure. So we're going to do a quick where are we, because we've had some changes. On government funding and debt limit, Congress addressed these two issues together back in July before the August recess. What they decided to do, the framework was done in July, and then in September they were able to address the issue. And what they decided to do was to move the current continuing resolution, keep the government open beyond September 30th, the end of the fiscal year, until December 8th. So the new deadline and the new talk of the when is the shutdown going to happen, and are we going to keep the government open? That has been postponed from September 30th to December 8th. But don't worry, we will revisit this, and this will continue to be a big issue as the appropriations and budget and government funding is continued beyond December 8th. There's a lot of negotiation left to do. Just because they were able to get a 3-month bill done does not mean that the two sides have really resolved the overall numbers and what agencies are going to receive and what's going to get cut. And there will be a lot of debate left on that. So more to come on government funding. On debt limit, that was really the other, probably the most pressing thing that as leaders on both sides of the Capitol and the administration look towards September 30th. That was a big deadline that we were staring down, was that sometime in the fall we would have to raise the debt limit in order to continue servicing the debt. And we've all heard the very dire warnings if we don't do that. And many members of Congress take that to heart, but that does not mean it's an easy vote, and that does not mean it's a bipartisan vote. So really that is always, in the last several years in particular, people viewed the debt limit as a disaster waiting to happen, and with very little upside for members of Congress. So what they did on the debt limit is they tied it to government funding. and they said we're going to essentially suspend the debt limit until December 8th, and keep servicing the debt until December 8th, raise it to where it needs to be raised, and then we'll address it then. What we know will happen on December 8th, because the congressional leadership has said it will happen, and this is what's happened in the past, is that we're going to get to December 8th, and Treasury is going to announce that they will take extraordinary measures to continue servicing the debt. So December 8th is not, unlike government funding, December 8th is not the real day that we deal with the debt limit. That is going to be dealt with in early 2018. And your guess is as good as mine for how long extraordinary measures goes. But it would not be surprising if we continue to service the debt until, probably February or March of 2018. So that is a Q1 2018 decision at this point. And the leadership and the administration are already prepared to spend political capital to deal with it, because it's a very important issue. But again, let's table that one and say that that is probably a early 2018 decision at this point. Disaster relief. This is something that of course, before this month was not something that Congress was considering, and now it comes to the forefront. So what we have seen is some temporary action in terms of making sure FEMA has money in the short term. You're going to see additional legislation beginning next week in the House, and then after that in the Senate, that's going to add additional supplemental funding for FEMA to make sure that they have adequate resources to respond to the recovery efforts in the wake of Hurricane Harvey and Irma and Maria. So really the states they're focused on there at most are Texas, Florida, and then of course Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So that is going to be a big issue and a continued effort. It seems like it will be bipartisan in nature, at least at first. But then after October, there is acknowledgement that there will need to be an additional bill on this, and that could come in November or December, and that's going to be a more long-term rebuilding effort. So disaster relief is going to be a big issue throughout the fall and into really into the end of the year, as the agencies continue to respond, and Congress provides more appropriations and more resources to deal with the wake of these three hurricanes. On healthcare, really September was not so much about what happened, but what didn't happen. The Affordable Care Act repeal and replace efforts led by congressional Republicans in the administration were revived in September, and then died again at the end of September. So what we have essentially right now is a budget that allows for reconciliation instructions, so allows the Senate to pass a bill with 51 votes instead of 60. And they had a budget to do health care with 51 votes, and that authority expires September 30th. So in 2 days, that will be officially the end of the effort on health care to do that under budget reconciliation. Now, that doesn't mean it's the end of the effort, period. There will still be some bipartisan measures that are discussed. The Children's Health Insurance Program is something that expires September 30th. And there's some acknowledgement that the House and Senate won't really deal with the CHIP reauthorization until later in the year. It might not actually pass into law until November or December. But the conventional wisdom is that states have enough money to continue with CHIP until then, and then there will be more money coming in December at the latest. So that's what's happening there. There could be another effort to repeal and replace the ACA. We know that from the president's comments and from also some comments made by some members of the House and Senate, although not necessarily the leadership. That is, of course, continues to be on the table. This could be something we talk about again at the end of the year or in 2018. But all we know now is that the budget that was going to allow them to do it is going away in 2 days, and that the House and Senate would have to do another budget for FY18 or FY19 if they look farther down the road to do healthcare on that. And there's something that is going to come as an intervening step, which we will get to right now with the and finally. So Jeremy, can you go to the next slide? So where are we going? Tax reform. That is the talk of the town. Yesterday, many of you saw the Big Six, which is the Republican key stakeholders in tax reform, which includes 2 people from the administration, the Treasury Secretary, Stephen Mnuchin, the National Economic Council Director, Gary Cohn, and then the leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, the leader of the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Orrin Hatch, Speaker Paul Ryan, and the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Kevin Brady. Those 6 minds comprise the Big Six, and they released a updated tax reform framework yesterday. It was a 9-page document, so not particularly heavy reading, but it generally is meant to be a document that says, here are the principles and here's the framework that we all agree to. And now let's go get it done. Let's do the requisite work in the committees, the Senate Finance Committee, the House Ways and Means Committee, and get a bill done as soon as possible. Right now, in terms of process, and then we'll get into the substance of what was released yesterday, there are a number of steps that are a bit complicated in nature that need to be done to lay the groundwork for tax reform. The first step is the budget, and we just talked about this with healthcare. The current budget reconciliation instructions expire September 30th. There was a determination that could not be used for tax reform anyways. So the House and Senate are going to be working the next couple of weeks, and expect a lot of headlines on this, on a new budget resolution for fiscal year 2018. What they will do with this budget is provide for reconciliation instructions to do tax reform. And that will be a process that will start in the House next week, and then move over to the Senate towards the end of the month. The significance of this budget is that they need this budget in order to pass tax reform in the Senate with 51 votes instead of 60. So it is absolutely a critical part of this process. And if you start to hear headlines and negative things about the odds that the Congress is able to agree on a budget, then you can rest assured that tax reform is not in good shape. But for now, the budget is moving along. Yesterday, after the release of the framework, the House Freedom Caucus, which is 40 of the hardline conservative members in the House, they signaled their support of the budget in order to get tax reform done. So while there's still a few details left to hammer out on the budget, the House appears poised to pass this next week, at which point it goes over to the Senate. Whenever the Senate considers budgets, there are always a lot of headlines around that because they have a process called vote-a-rama, where the Senate just takes votes on literally dozens and dozens of amendments back to back to the budget. There's very little debate. I think there's generally less than 5 minutes of debate on all the amendments as they come up, and the Senate votes oftentimes all night and holds dozens of votes. So we can expect that to happen when it goes to the Senate. The Senate's going to start marking up next week, and then after it passes the House, we expect the Senate to take it up later in October, and that's their target end date. Once they have the budget, if they are able to do that, that is a critical first step. Then we believe that Ways and Means will convene a markup before Thanksgiving. It is possible that they could convene the markup as early as the end of next month, so the end of October, or early November. They don't want to wait any longer than that, and that will be really the official legislative beginning of tax reform, as a product will have started to come together at that point. And Republicans on the committee will look to report out tax reform, the legislation along party lines. We don't expect it to be bipartisan, but because of the budget that they hope to successfully pass, it won't need to be. It will likely just in the House, of course, just be a Republican product, and it may stay that way in the Senate. Speaking of the Senate, the House always starts on these kinds of things, it seems like. The Senate, though, will certainly want to make modifications. And that is a process that we'll see after the House Ways and Means Committee has a product and it goes to the House floor. Then the Senate will begin really taking that and forming it to their will, putting their imprint on it. And we do expect significant changes because it's going to be a large bill. We don't know what that will be yet, but we have some ideas of maybe some of the major themes around that, which we'll get into in a second. And then they hope to finish, really to get tax reform finished by the first quarter of 2017. And you'll hear a lot in the House that they want to have this bill out of the House by the end of the year. I do think that's a realistic timeline. It's by no means a guarantee, and tax reform is very hard. That's why we haven't done it since 1986. But I do think that they have a good chance based on the timeline that we're looking at, that they're looking at, to get this out of the House by the end of the year. But of course, I'm sorry, this says Q1 2017. Q1 2018 is their target finish, and because the Senate is going to take some time, and there will be additional modifications needed. And we know tax reform impacts a large part of the economy, and we'll have a lot of changes. So we do expect if they do, they could meet the House timeline and finish by the end of the year. But we don't expect anything to really be finished before the end of Q1 2018. But of course, it could go longer. But that is what they are hoping for at this point. Can we go to the next slide? So maybe we could take a moment to talk about the legislative issues in tax reform, and certainly welcome questions to this, which we'll address at the end of the webinar. But if anybody has a question, they can go ahead and begin typing it now. So some of the big issues that NAST is following, and then we'll talk about how we can have an impact on this debate. Municipal bonds. So tax exempt status of municipal bonds is the number one priority of NAST, and that continues to be the focus of our conversations on the Hill, but also many of our allies in the public and private sector. So the good news that we have to report is that the Ways and Means Committee Chairman Kevin Brady has signaled several times that in private conversations that we're in good shape at this point on muni bonds. We're getting positive indications that where the House is right now, they don't plan to actively limit or eliminate the tax exempt status of municipal bonds. The framework that was released yesterday, like I said, 9 pages. It does not get into the kind of specificity where you could really read into it as a plan and say it's going to be maintained or it's not. But there was a member call indicating that removing the tax exemption is not being considered. So that is a very good thing. One thing that we continue to worry about is that tax exempt muni bonds could get caught up in different changes to the code. So there wouldn't necessarily be a plan to limit or eliminate it, but you could have things like a high income surtax, an additional top rate. We saw a limitation in the previous tax reform draft, the camp draft that came out a couple of years ago, that would have really limited and diminished the attractiveness of tax exempt municipal bonds. So we want to make sure that that nothing happens that is going to do that either intentionally or on accident. But the framework is something that does not specifically mention muni bonds, but we've gotten very positive feedback, and so have members of Congress that have been very interested in this issue. That things are on the right track. Now, it is not a good idea to stop advocating on it. because in our opinion, all these things come back, and muni bonds is an idea that will be on the table at the end of the day if they need revenue. And we need to be constantly reminding people that should not be a very palatable option for members of Congress, and it will be very damaging back home to their states, cities, municipalities, and it's not a good idea. 529 Enable programs, to mention that for a second, again, doesn't mention retaining or making any changes to the 529 or 529 Cap A, which is the ABLE program. But we do know also from feedback that that is not something that's being considered at this point, which is exactly where we want to be. We do know from the previous House draft that came out, not legislative text, but plan, that blueprint, that they see 529s as a model for education savings, and that is something they would look to expand rather than take away. So again, you know, and we all remember when ABLE became law about 3 years ago, the very, very popular program all across Congress in a bipartisan way. We do not envision at all any attempts to cut or eliminate ABLE programs through tax reform either. So both continue to be in good shape, but we continue to monitor where the discussions go on that. It's worth noting that the framework does contain a section talking about education, and it just says that they plan to retain tax benefits that encourage higher education and also work in retirement security. So we think that probably captures 529 and ABLE through that, but that's all interpretation. Retirement and savings is something that you know, I think we look at not as something that could have an impact as well on state budgets and on state plans. On retirement, you know, there's a lot of talk about a change to an all Roth approach for 401k, 403b, and 457b plans. This is something we talked about at the conference. And there's also some other ideas out there like possible limits on pre-tax deferral. You know, in the framework, again, not super specific, but it does talk about the Rothification of various plans, and that does seem to be a general direction that Congress is headed in as they contemplate tax reform. And then, you know, finally, some other state and local issues. We always look at conformity issues with the federal system. You know, states using certain states using the federal system as a starting point for various things around adjusted gross income, deductions, and credits. So anything done, of course, at the federal level could have revenue implications to states. And then another thing we look at, which is I would say is rising in possibility, is the elimination of the state and local tax deduction. And that's something that I would say if there was a list of top pay floors at this point that would bring the revenue in needed to lower the rates to to where they have it in the framework, I think that that the state and local tax deduction would be at the very top of that list. And there is a very serious possibility that if tax reform were to happen tomorrow, that they would eliminate or limit the state and local tax deduction. So that is something that we continue to monitor and report on. We know, you know, while that's not NAST's top issue in tax reform, we know of the impact to different states, and we also know that many of the governors and other officials in the states are very active on that issue and are, as we speak, descending on Capitol Hill to talk about it. So that's something we're following. There's a relatively large pay for associated with the elimination of state and local tax deduction. So it is a very attractive target as lawmakers look for a way to get the rates down as part of this process. To stop for a second and talk about some of the challenges, you know, we already have seen one iteration of tax reform that has not that had to be dropped, and that was the border adjustment tax that was included in the in kind of the early proposals that the House was considering. So we know that no matter what the pay for is, there is going to be a significant lobbying effort against it because it's going to impact somebody. So we know that, for instance, going towards eliminating the state and local tax deduction will certainly generate some hesitancy from particularly Republican majority members from states that would severely impact. So looking at the 9 Republicans in the New York delegation, for instance, or the Republicans in the Illinois or California delegation in the House, those are certainly would have some challenges to do that. We also know that there are various other things that need to be looked at in terms of, to go to the corporate side for a second, as they go to a territorial system, there is likely going to be some sort of minimum tax regime, and that minimum tax regime and really the details of it are going to really make or break this proposal for multinational companies and companies either headquartered here or headquartered abroad. They will have a very specific impact on those. So that's something to definitely stay tuned to. And as tax reform moves forward, the challenges will become more clear. I would say, one part of this proposal is to increase the standard deduction, and that presents some challenges as well. I think you'll see the real estate and broker community and others, home builders, come forward and have some issues with that approach, because the direction they're going would limit the mortgage interest deduction, and that's something that's very important to those associations and their members. So we see a host of challenges like that there as well, which informs us as to the health of the overall effort. So those are things that we're following, and we'll continue to keep the Legislative Committee and NAST updated on those issues as well. And then finally, on advocacy, how do we have an impact on all of this? There are a couple things to keep in mind here. This is not going to be a process that moves quickly, despite the best efforts of the House, which will try to expedite this as quickly as possible. Things always slow down in the Senate. This is a very big proposal that's going to have a very big impact on the economy, and it's going to have a very specific impact on individuals, small businesses, corporations, and it is not something that can move quickly. So there are going to be opportunities to weigh in. We always say the best time to weigh in is before any pen has been put to paper, and our focus on that has really been looking at those first two issues on this list, on muni bonds, 529 and ABLE, really having that dialogue on the front end. The Congressional Municipal Finance Caucus, which we talk about quite a bit, chaired by Congressman Randy Holtgren from Illinois and Dutch Ruppersberger from Maryland, a bipartisan caucus, has talked extensively about this issue with folks on the Ways and Means Committee in the White House, the Senate Finance Committee, and they have worked this issue very hard to prevent anything bad from going in the proposal at the beginning and not having to try to take it out later. But we do know that as tax reform moves forward, that there are always proposals that weren't on the table at first that come to the table later, and we need to be very vigilant about that. And we also need to keep up really the message and the priorities coming out of NAST, which is talking to your members of Congress, particularly if they're on the Ways and Means Committee. They're obviously very important, but really all members of Congress. You could say that in terms of the way this effort's coming together, Republicans are going to be at a premium for votes as they move this through the House and Senate. So if there are members that prioritize muni bonds so much that they're willing to say, I'm not going to vote for tax reform if it does anything bad to tax-exempt munis, then that's a very good member that we should cultivate and make sure we continue to work on as the process goes forward, because they will have a big voice whether they're on the Ways and Means Committee or not. And then, of course, the senators. So if you come from a state with one Republican senator or two Republican senators, I'd say that is probably the most important thing you can do at this point, is be talking to them about muni bonds and about 529s and ABLE, and just but particularly muni bonds, because that's where the focus could shift. Just talking about the importance to your state on that. They always want to hear, they always want to know that story about the importance to the state, which you guys do a really good job of telling. So that's something that we really need to do. On the 529 and Able side, we all have state stories now as well, and they want to hear about how many assets under management, how many families have accounts, how much people have saved, and how it's really helping people across the income spectrum afford college. So these are really big issues that members of Congress are thinking about. But we should keep reminding them as the process goes forward. So that would really be my advocacy plea, and I know Treasurer Damson and I at the end will save a little bit of time for discussion, and that may come up again. And Treasurer Damson has a very good view into this and insights into this as well about the importance of that advocacy. So welcome any discussion of that at the end. Jeremy, can we do the next slide? I'll move through this quickly so we have time for discussion. 2018 preview. I put infrastructure on here not because there's a plan, but because if we don't put it, then everyone's going to say, I thought we were going to do infrastructure. So that's why there's a question mark next to it. And really, there should be a question mark next to it, because the plan to do infrastructure spending, an infrastructure bill, as much as $1 trillion worth of infrastructure spending in 2017, clearly is not going to happen at this point. Because of the extended focus on healthcare that really took us through the end of September, and now the pivot to tax reform, there's going to be very little real movement around infrastructure, other than some hearings, some discussions, bicameral, bipartisan discussions. Infrastructure legislation is not going to move, aside from some disaster recovery measures that we'll see in the coming weeks and months. So infrastructure is hopefully something that Congress will tackle in 2018. I say hopefully from I know from our organization's perspective and the states, but also a lot of members of Congress really want to work on infrastructure and see the need to see our infrastructure needs across the country. And there is a definite commitment on the part of many members, Republican and Democratic, to work on infrastructure and get a bill done. They know, having conversations with the White House, that the White House is still very bought into infrastructure. It's something that the president talks about a lot. And there are certainly people in Congress that hope that talk can turn into action, the specific legislation, into negotiations, and into a package that can be considered in 2018, led by the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Senate Commerce Committee, Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. All these committees, the hope is they get together and they can work out a package that makes a big investment in infrastructure. There has been some talk of tying infrastructure to tax reform. I don't think that's likely. I think tax reform is something that is big enough and complicated enough on its own. So I think to set expectations, I think nothing happens really on infrastructure until tax reform is done. And then when tax reform is either done successfully or unsuccessfully, then the attention will turn to infrastructure, and we'll see some efforts on highways, aviation. There are some reauthorizations like the Federal Aviation Administration and other things that will probably be wrapped up into a larger infrastructure discussion as well. So that's something that we will, I think we will see in 2018, but we just can't put a date on it yet, because tax reform is clearly in the queue first. Reauthorizations, I just mentioned because we do have a number of those coming up. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, which we just mentioned, that is set to expire in 2 days, but likely tomorrow the House will act. The House acted, the Senate acted, and now they need one more action to get that extended to prevent a shutdown on September 30th. So that is something that will be dealt with again, likely in early 2018. The Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, we mentioned, is probably The target is December, although the House is going to start the process of moving a bill through committee next week. And then we've got FY 2018 appropriations, December 8th. That is still a really big date. The National Flood Insurance Program is also extended through December 8th. So NFIP will be a big issue, especially as the recovery efforts continue from the hurricanes. And then a couple things that expire at the end of the year: the National Defense Authorization, NDAA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, and then one other thing to mention is just the noise around immigration and the Dreamers. That is something also that President Trump has said Congress must address, and gave them 6 months to do so. But I think really December is going to be the critical time period to watch there around the budget and appropriations. We could expect to see something done around that. It includes border security and maybe some legislation around the deferred action for childhood arrivals. So with that, Jeremy, questions and contact information. So everybody has the contact information on the screen here. And we are happy to take any questions or dialogue, or I will turn it over to you, Treasurer Damchen. I don't see any questions in the queue right now, but I'm sure it's because everyone's typing something out right now.
I agree, Matt. I'm sure that's what it is, and we will be online for another couple of minutes, watching for questions. Just to add emphasis, I guess, to Matt's earlier comments, this is really just the beginning, and it's going to be a very complicated and probably spirited debate and process as we go along. And the thing that concerns me the most, and to me this is why we should be energized to keep talking to our delegations, is these cuts. I just let me lay this out, Matt. Tell me if I'm wrong on the numbers. I'm looking at a passage in a Wall Street Journal piece the other day. According to an estimate from the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the framework calls for about $5.8 trillion in tax cuts over a decade, and includes about $3.6 trillion in revenue-raising provisions, leaving a net cut of $2.2 trillion. It goes on to say Senate Republicans are eyeing a plan that would allow $1.5 trillion in tax cuts over a decade. And you couple that with comments made by Senator Corker, and there may be some other things that we're hearing, and Matt, you can tell us if there are other sort of initial murmurings that we should be aware of. There are those, and I'm glad that they're voicing the concerns. There are those that are saying we really need to stop adding to this $20 trillion debt. And so that's going to be part of the discussion. You're going to see, I think you're going to see lobbyists for the real estate industry very concerned about the potential decline in importance or impact of the mortgage interest deduction under this new structure. And so I think when they're all getting around the table trying to find ways to pay for these tax cuts, the things that we would like to think are sacrosanct, like municipal bond interest, and we've talked about this a little bit at the annual conference in Boston, those things could come back onto the table and they could enter back into discussion. And that's why Matt is encouraging, and I'm encouraging you all to keep up those conversations with your delegations. But Matt, so based on that, what are your thoughts, and what else are you hearing, and where do you see the hardest discussions happening? You know, what are the most interesting aspects that you see here based on the initial blueprint?
Yes, Treasurer, you hit on a number of the really important points here. A couple of things that I would just point out after this framework. A lot of the press coverage, a lot of the response from the business community, from many of the associations that represent individual taxpayers, they like the concepts here, right? They like the getting the corporate rate down to 20%, getting the pass-through rate down to 25%. having the three simple brackets, 12, 25, and 35%, where most people are going to pay less than they did without tax reform. So there's a lot here to like. What we haven't done as much talking about, and what the framework doesn't really get into, are some of the very hard decisions that tax writers are going to have to make over the next over the coming months. And those are the decisions that really impact whether this is a net positive or a net negative for corporations, depending on where they're headquartered. So depending on how the rules around this move to a territorial system are orchestrated, that will mean very good things or very bad things for many of the people that are following this from the corporate perspective. You mentioned the Wall Street Journal and the analysis of the shortcomings. So, look, the plan is very costly. As you mentioned, those are the same numbers that we're looking at. And I think the idea here is that by going to changing the scoring and doing dynamic scoring assumptions in this, that the economy is going to do better because of these cuts, particularly the cut in the corporate rate and some other things, and we're going to have a positive economic analysis out of that, and that's going to help narrow that gap a little bit. But there are going to have to be other pay-fors. And when the border adjustment tax fell out of the plan, that was a big deal because that was worth about $1 trillion. And taking $1 trillion out of the plan leaves a significant shortfall. So that's why people are looking at the difficult things they are looking at, like eliminating the state and local tax deduction, and some of the other proposals on the table, because at some point that will have to happen, and what they do will be unpopular with a lot of stakeholders. So that's why we need to really continue the fight, not only on muni bonds, but also on college savings and ABLE programs. People need to be constantly reminded that if they're looking for cuts across the board and they're looking to limit or eliminate tax expenditures, that they need to look elsewhere. So that's going to be really that's the crux of what we're looking at here. I do see one question that I'll start with here. It says combining tax reform and infrastructure was unlikely. I mentioned that, but what about the once popular idea of using repatriated corporate profits to fund infrastructure needs? Is that on the table, and are those proceeds already claimed? So that is it's certainly a very popular proposal that has really dominated the infrastructure world for a long time. Is the idea of having businesses bring back having a repatriation holiday. Businesses bring back profits that are trapped overseas. When they bring them back, they pay some sort of lower tax rate than the full rate they would have to pay under current law. And then those proceeds would be used to fund and to close the gap with our critical infrastructure needs. So I would say if tax reform falls apart, that will continue to be and may even increase in likelihood that a proposal like that could happen. That is a very serious proposal that does have some bipartisan support and could happen. But when I say tax reform is going first, really that is first in the queue. And tax reform, of course, will change our the way we tax profits and tax companies that operate abroad. And repatriation is absolutely going to be a part of that. So the framework proposes it's called Bring Profits Back Home. The framework brings home profits by imposing a one-time low tax rate on wealth that has been accumulated overseas, so there's no tax incentive to keep the money offshore. They're going to have to fill in more details with that. But if tax reform happens and there is a repatriation element of that, which there almost certainly will be, then that would take that off the table for infrastructure. So the success or failure of tax reform here will have an impact on whether or not that's a proposal that that could happen independent of that later on. Another question is Treasurer Damson, do you have anything to add to that?
No, Matt. I was just going to move on to the question that you were about to state. The question says, does NAST have an official position on the state and local tax deduction? The answer is no. At this point, we do not. That's something that we could work on. It could be challenging because it's a political issue, and so those conservatives would say that the exemption that we currently have in place is a inefficient subsidy to high tax states, and so there are fair arguments for moving the direction that this reform package is headed in. From a conservative perspective, if you're in a high tax state, that's where you'll take the brunt of it, and that some might argue rightfully refocuses the taxpayers' frustrations on state and local entities that are taxing them at those levels, maybe less so than the federal government. But that's something that we could discuss. But at this point, no, we do not have a formal position within NAST.
Yeah, Treasurer, that's right, and I think you addressed some of the issues around it. I mean, I think one thing to consider as we think about our advocacy efforts and whether or not to take a position on various pay-fors that come along, we've clearly defined as an organization what our number one priority is in tax reform, and that's preserving the tax-exempt status of municipal bonds. Some might argue that if we got too far out there on other pay-fors, so if we were seen as really championing the fight or putting a lot of capital expenditure into a fight on a different pay-for, then I think some people could go back and say, well, okay, yeah, this pay-for is coming out, but then we're going to replace it with this pay-for. And I think our worst fear would be to go really far out on a limb, opposing a certain pay-for, and then the next pay-for that they go to is tax-exempt muni bonds. Because then when we go back to the same people and we say, oh, you can't do that either, then of course we've lost some of our effectiveness. So, I always say, and I think it's something, it shouldn't prevent us from ever acting, and it shouldn't make us too scared to do anything. But it is something worth keeping in the back of our minds. What are some of the trade-offs here? And one of the sensitivities around the state and local tax deduction is you could certainly see people looking at state and local tax deduction and tax-exempt munis in a similar bucket. Kind of things that from the realms of state and local and municipal governments. And we would certainly not want them to say, okay, well, here are the two options we looked at. This one sounds like it's a no-go, so we're going to go to this one. So I think we just need to be a little bit cautious in our engagement on that. But certainly there are lots of actors in this fight, and there have already been several meetings convened from some of the stakeholders and some of the states you might expect on this, like some states in the Northeast and Illinois and California. We know some of those members of Congress are already getting together and saying, okay, we need to get them to look at something else. So we'll see how those efforts go, and certainly if NAST decides to take a position on it, then we'll be helpful in devising a plan and in going to the Hill and communicating that position. But I think I don't want to say it's a certainty that that's going to be in the initial plan, but even if it was a certainty that it would be in the House plan, this plan is going to go through many iterations and many changes between what we have today and what we'll see in first quarter 2018 at the earliest. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on.
Matt, if one of our members is going to head to DC or engage members of their delegation in other ways in the next 2 to 8 weeks or whatever, can they call you or email you and ask for help on talking points, or ask you for strategic insight, talking about the various members of their delegation and how to prioritize the folks to talk to. What falls within the scope of NAST's contract with Williams and Jensen as it pertains to that kind of sort of personalized assistance with advocacy efforts? And that's just a question I have myself, and might help for those of us on the line to hear your take on that.
Absolutely, Treasurer. They both fall squarely within the scope of what we can do, and we would sincerely look forward to the opportunity to do that, to have those conversations. So my contact information is on the screen there, and please don't hesitate to do that. Treasurer, you mentioned the two things would probably be the first two things that I would that I think it would be valuable to talk about when people are coming here and preparing to engage with their delegation is, first of all, kind of we can provide some background information on somebody might already have some positions or might have some related positions to tax-exempt muni bonds, and we can communicate that. We can also talk a little bit more about the strategy of like, well, okay, this person is viewed as a close ally of this person. In the House side right now, the two key people on tax reform are Speaker Paul Ryan and Chairman Kevin Brady. So we can kind of provide those insights, but then we can really go through your whole delegation and kind of figure out, if you're going to hit 3 or 4 people, these are the ones that I would make sure to talk to. But obviously, the more the better. And then the other question about some personalized outreach, that really goes a long ways, and that's something that I think is a hallmark of NAST when we go to the Hill. We can really talk about our state and talk about the issues that matter to these members. So what we've done and what we have as a resource is a one-pager on tax-exempt munis, where we can really just plug in numbers from courtesy of SIFMA, of the Muni Credit Report, and we can just say, here's what the tax exemption means to, here's what municipal bonds mean to your state, and then it goes through and it'll say, here's how much we have in transportation bonds and education bonds, and go through that list, and then we can say, here's how many, how much in bonds that have been issued. And I know you already have, and your staffs already have a lot of that information. But we also have the SIFMA report, the one that we've been using is the year-end 2016 report, which has some, obviously fairly updated numbers. So we would definitely appreciate the opportunity to provide that information upon request as well, if people would like to use that in their outreach.
I appreciate that, Matt. I think we're about out of time.
I see one more question, Treasurer.
Oh, yes, the one about coalitions and fractures?
Well, no, scrolling down here, word on the next meeting of the Speaker's Task Force on Intergovernmental Affairs. And I'm glad somebody mentioned that.
I gotcha.
The Speaker's Task Force was obviously stood up by Speaker Paul Ryan, and he put the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, Rob Bishop from Utah, in charge of that, somebody that Treasurer Damschen certainly knows. And we have talked to Chairman Bishop and his staff, and first of all, I don't think there's a better selection to lead that task force because he really, really, really cares about cities and municipalities and his mayors and counties, and he is very passionate about the way government interacts with each other. So he really is, in our mind, the ideal person to lead this. And there was going to be a meeting actually coming up, but it was canceled due to a personal death in a family. So we don't have a specific word on the next meeting, but we know since they just canceled one that they're going to want to get another one on the book soon. So we actually had a conversation with Chairman Bishop's staff on Wednesday, and no word yet, so that's fresh information, but we'll communicate that as soon as we have one. And NAST is fortunate to have a seat at that table, and I think it's a good table to have a seat at. And we very much look forward to engaging with the new task force and sharing our perspective on intergovernmental affairs and the role of states.
All right. Thanks, Matt. That was very informative, and I think hopefully we'll see some forward progress. Going back to Senator Corker, he expressed a pretty ominous opinion on tax reform, comparing it to healthcare reform, which of course hasn't been successful, suggesting, as many others have, that this is an even heavier lift than healthcare reform. And so this is going to be very interesting to watch, and we're very appreciative that we have Williams Jensen and Matt in particular to help us sort through the goings on and understand the implications to us and our constituents at the state level. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and thanks to Matt and Jeremy for putting this call together. Thanks for the questions, and hold on to Matt's contact information. Be sure and reach out and take advantage of that relationship that we have for any assistance that you might need in your advocacy efforts going forward. And have a great day.
Thank you.